The cold air of Arlington National Cemetery was heavy with sorrow. A biting wind swept through the endless rows of white headstones, rustling the American flags placed beside them. The sky was overcast, casting a gray shadow over the mourners gathered for the funeral of Major Benjamin Scott. At the front of the procession stood General Christopher Hayes, a towering presence despite the weight of grief on his shoulders. At 58, he had seen more than his fair share of funerals, but this one cut deeper than most, because this wasn't just another fallen soldier. This was Benjamin Scott, a brother in arms, a trusted friend, a man who had saved his life more times than he could count. As the honor guard stood at attention, their crisp uniforms unmoving in the wind, the folded flag was presented to Benjamin's widow, Emily Scott. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, her face pale and hollow with grief. The 21-gun salute rang through the air, sharp, precise, final. Each shot felt like a hammer to Christopher's chest, a reminder of the sacrifices men like Benjamin made every day. Christopher's gaze drifted to the polished casket, draped in the stars and stripes resting above the freshly dug earth. It didn't seem real. He clenched his fists at his sides, jaw tight. He had been a general for years. He had ordered men into battle. He had seen death up close. But this was different. As the priest's voice carried over the wind, reciting the final rites, Christopher made a silent vow. Benjamin Scott would not be forgotten, and if there was more to his death than what they were being told, then Christopher would damn well find out the truth. The solemn silence of Arlington National Cemetery was shattered in an instant. One moment, General Christopher Hayes stood in quiet reverence, paying his final respects to his fallen friend. The next, he found himself staring down the barrel of a police-issued Glock 17. Glock 17. "Get on the ground, now!" The voice was sharp, commanding, unyielding. Christopher turned his head slowly, his years of military discipline keeping his expression neutral, despite the absurdity of what was happening. Standing just a few yards away was Sergeant Mark Phillips, a burly, thick-shouldered white police officer in his early 40s. His stance was rigid, finger-tight on the trigger, eyes cold with authority. At his side, his younger partner, Officer Ryan Caldwell, stood frozen. At 25, Caldwell was fresh-faced, barely more than a rookie, and it showed. His fingers hovered near his holstered weapon, but he looked uncertain, uneasy, as if he knew something was wrong, but lacked the courage to say it. "On the ground. Now! Hands behind your head!" Phillips barked again, stepping closer. Murmurs rippled through the funeral crowd. Gasps of shock, confusion, fear. The honor guards, trained to protect and respect, instinctively tensed, but no one moved. This was a police officer, a man of authority. To resist would only escalate the situation. Christopher, however, had spent decades in war zones. He had seen real threats. And this was something else entirely. He took a measured breath, slowly raising his hands, but his voice remained calm. "Sergeant," he said evenly, "this is a funeral. What exactly do you think you're doing?" Phillips didn't waver. His grip on the gun tightened. "I said on the ground." Christopher's sharp eyes flicked to Caldwell. The young officer swallowed hard, his fingers twitching. He knew this was wrong, but he said nothing. The cold metal of Phillips' gun gleamed in the dull light. This was not a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, and Christopher Hayes wanted to know why. The cemetery stood still, frozen in collective disbelief. A 4-star general, one of the most respected military leaders in the country, was being held at gunpoint at a funeral of all places. But General Christopher Hayes, he didn't flinch. His hands remained raised, his expression calm but calculating, his mind working fast. He had been in war zones, faced enemy fire, survived ambushes in hostile territories. This was nothing. But the fact that it was happening at all was deeply troubling. "Sergeant," Hayes said, his voice steady, authoritative, "you're making a grave mistake." Phillips didn't budge. His jaw was clenched, his grip firm, his stance wide. This wasn't a scared officer acting out of panic. This was intentional. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Soldiers, officers, and government officials stood in stunned silence. Some looked ready to intervene, their hands twitching near their holsters. Others simply stared, unable to process what they were witnessing. A funeral was sacred, a place of honor, respect, and mourning. And yet here was a uniformed police officer aiming his gun at a man who had dedicated his life to protecting this country. It didn't add up. "Sergeant." Hayes's voice turned colder, sharper. A warning. Phillips didn't lower his weapon. If anything, his finger inched closer to the trigger. But Christopher Hayes was no ordinary man. He squared his shoulders, standing taller, eyes locked onto Phillips like a commander assessing a threat on the battlefield. "If you don't stand down," Hayes continued, "this will end very badly for you. And I promise you, whatever you think you're doing, whatever you've been told, you're wrong." Phillips hesitated, just for a second. And that second was all Hayes needed to know. Something bigger was at play. This wasn't random. Hayes glanced at Officer Ryan Caldwell, the younger cop who still hadn't drawn his weapon, his face tight with unease. He knew something. But would he speak? The air crackled with tension. The next move could change everything. The air at Arlington National Cemetery had never felt heavier. The sharp wind carried shocked whispers through the mourners, rippling across the uniformed soldiers and high-ranking officials in attendance. Everyone had the same question burning in their minds. Why was a police officer aiming a gun at General Christopher Hayes? The silence was suffocating. Then, Colonel Olivia Morgan stepped forward. A no-nonsense officer in her mid-50s, Morgan had served alongside Hayes for over 20 years. She had seen battlefields soaked in blood, led missions into enemy territory, and sat at briefing tables where wars were decided. She knew when to speak and when to act. This was one of those moments. Her boots crunched against the frozen ground as she strode toward Phillips. Her steel-gray eyes locked onto him like a predator circling its prey. "Sergeant Phillips." Her voice was sharp as a blade, cutting through the tension. Phillips flinched slightly, but his gun remained steady until Morgan uttered the words that sealed his fate. "Do you have any idea who you're pointing that weapon at?" The color drained from Phillips' face. Morgan took another step closer, her voice low but lethal. "You're standing in a military cemetery aiming your gun at a 4-star general of the United States Army." A murmur swept through the crowd. Soldiers exchanged stunned glances. The honor guards stiffened, their hands inching toward their holsters. Phillips staggered back slightly, his gun hand shaking. "What?" His voice cracked. Morgan folded her arms. "You heard me. General Christopher Hayes, recipient of the Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, and 3 Silver Stars. A man who has led more soldiers into battle than you've written parking tickets." Phillips' grip weakened. This wasn't just some guy in uniform. This was a legend. And he had just held him at gunpoint in front of an entire funeral procession. A flicker of pure panic flashed in Phillips' eyes. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that he was in control. Now, he looked like a man who had just realized he had walked straight off a cliff. The whispers grew louder. Hayes didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply watched, calculated, because now the question wasn't just what Phillips had done, it was why. The realization hit Sergeant Mark Phillips like a freight train. His hands trembled, his gun still partially raised, but now his confidence was gone. The cemetery was silent, all eyes locked on him, judging, waiting, knowing. General Christopher Hayes didn't move, his expression cold, unwavering. A lifetime of military discipline had hardened him against fear, but the way he now looked at Phillips, it wasn't anger. It was something worse. Disdain. "Your gun, your badge, your uniform," Hayes said, his voice measured and lethal. "They don't make you untouchable." Phillips swallowed hard. Before he could speak, the military police MPs arrived. 2 officers in dark uniforms, their presence imposing, absolute. One of them, a stern-faced MP sergeant, stepped forward. "Drop the weapon," Phillips blinked, his pulse thundering in his ears. "Aye. Now." The command wasn't just an order, it was final. A long, excruciating pause filled the cemetery. Phillips' mind raced, searching for a way out, a lifeline. He glanced at Officer Ryan Caldwell, his partner, his supposed backup. But Caldwell, he didn't move. He didn't even meet Phillips' gaze. His hand stayed firmly away from his gun, his face tight with barely contained guilt. He wasn't going to help. No one was. The truth was clear. Phillips was alone. Slowly, his grip weakened. The gun in his hand shook before he finally, reluctantly, let it fall to the frozen ground. The moment the weapon hit the dirt, the MPs moved in, hands behind your back. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around Phillips's wrists. His breathing was shallow, frantic, his face burning with humiliation. How had this happened? How had everything turned against him so quickly? The MPs began leading him away, but before they could disappear from sight, Hayes stepped forward just enough for Phillips to hear his final words. "You wanted to be the one in control. Now look at you." Phillips didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. As the MPs dragged him off, he wasn't a sergeant anymore. He was just another man who thought he was untouchable until justice proved him wrong. The clank of handcuffs, the scuff of boots against the frozen earth, Sergeant Mark Phillips was done. As the military police hauled him away, his face a mask of disbelief and humiliation, the gathered crowd barely spared him a second glance. The whispers that once buzzed with tension and confusion had now turned into murmurs of quiet disgust. Phillips had come in thinking he had power. He left in disgrace. But General Christopher Hayes didn't watch him go. He had more important matters to attend to. With a deep breath, Hayes turned back toward the flag-draped casket of Major Benjamin Scott. The momentary disruption had stained the ceremony, but Hayes refused to let it define the day. Scott's widow, Emily, sat with tear-filled eyes, clutching the folded flag against her chest. She had been forced to endure not just the loss of her husband, but also the chaos and disrespect that had nearly overshadowed this moment. Hayes wouldn't let that stand. With measured steps, he approached the casket one last time. He straightened his uniform, brought his hand to his brow, and delivered a final salute, one that held decades of friendship, loyalty, and respect. The honor guard resumed their formation, and the ceremony continued as it should have all along. The echo of the 21-gun salute rang through the cemetery, each shot carrying a weight far heavier than words. Hayes closed his eyes briefly, letting the moment settle deep within him. Benjamin Scott was gone, but his sacrifice would not be forgotten. Phillips was nothing more than a footnote in a much greater story. A man who had let arrogance and recklessness destroy his own career. But Scott, he was the real hero. And today, despite the ugly spectacle, he was finally given the honor he deserved. 3 days later, the headlines exploded across news channels. Sergeant Mark Phillips dishonorably discharged, facing multiple charges: unlawful use of force, abuse of power, and misconduct under investigation. The footage played on repeat, Phillips being led away in handcuffs, his once confident stance replaced with defeat. The same officer who had stood firm, barking orders at a 4-star general, was now a disgraced man, his career over. General Christopher Hayes watched the news report from his office, arms crossed, face unreadable. He didn't feel triumph. Phillips had done this to himself. He didn't feel relief. Justice had already been served at Arlington. What he felt was something heavier, something deeper. Because Phillips wasn't the problem. He was a symptom of something bigger. For every Phillips who got caught, there was another waiting in the shadows, ready to abuse their authority, to wield their power recklessly, to disregard duty and honor in favor of control. And that was the real fight. Hayes exhaled, shifting his gaze from the television to the military commendations on his wall. He had fought in wars on foreign soil, commanded troops in some of the most dangerous battles of the modern era. But this was a war on home soil, and it was far from over. As the reporter droned on about Phillips' possible trial, Hayes picked up his phone. "Colonel Morgan," he said, his voice steady. "Sir? We need to talk." Because if Phillips could so easily turn a moment of honor into a stain of disgrace, then Hayes had to ask himself, how many more were out there? And more importantly, how many were already in positions of power waiting for their moment to strike? Moral of the story: power doesn't come from a badge or a gun. It doesn't come from a uniform, a title, or authority granted by the state. True power comes from integrity, respect, and justice, the qualities that define real leaders, not tyrants in disguise. Sergeant Mark Phillips believed he was above consequences. He saw himself as the enforcer, the one in control, the man who could do as he pleased without question. But power without accountability is a dangerous thing. And in the end, he learned the hard way: no one is untouchable. Even in the most sacred moments, like a funeral meant to honor a fallen soldier, racism and abuse of power can rear their ugly heads. But men like General Christopher Hayes prove that true leadership will always prevail. Where Phillips sought control, Hayes stood firm with dignity. Where Phillips acted with reckless authority, Hayes responded with unshakable strength. Phillips thought he could intimidate his way to power, but the only thing he earned was disgrace. The lesson? Tyranny doesn't last, and those who use their power to serve only themselves will always fall to those who use it to serve others.